If you've been watching the Olympics recently, you may have seen an advertisement where there's a little girl who wants to write a letter to one of her heroes, an Olympian. And the advertisement directs parents to use Google's AI to help their daughter write a letter to her favorite athlete. It's supposed to be inspiring. It's supposed to say, hey, this AI tool will help you find the words you didn't have. In one sense, I don't blame the makers of this advertisement. I think they had good intentions. I worry, though, as someone who cares deeply about language, especially about the minutiae of composition of poetry, because if we outsource to algorithms the very expression of that which we most care about, we will outsource, I think, something essentially human. Today I want to talk about how to harness the power of language in order to make our words not just mean what we want them to mean, but to lift language into the realm of song. I want to talk about prosody. Prosody is the study of the metrical structure of the English language. You can do Latin prosody, you can do Spanish prosody. I want to talk about English prosody. Rather than outsourcing to AI the things we most want to write about, we should so study language and so become familiar with language that we can outstrip any machine in our mastery of these sounds we make with our mouth and these marks we make on the page in order to preserve that which has been handed down to us, namely the metrical structures and art of poetry. I think the best place to begin is to think about how words are structured when we say them. When we write words on the page, we think about letters, we think about lines, sentences, paragraphs. If we're thinking about poetry, we're thinking about lines and stanzas, maybe. But when we think about prosody, we need to think about syllables first and foremost. Every word we say is made up of syllables. In English, every syllable we pronounce is either stressed more or less or unstressed more or less. We can see this with our names. My name is Timothy. I stress the Tim more than the uthi. We might say Tim is the stressed syllable, followed by two unstressed syllables, uthi. My last name is Bartel. Lots of people like to pronounce it Bartle, but that's not my name. You might say, well, it is your name, it's just a different pronunciation of it. But we actually so care about the metrical structures of language that if someone pronounces our name wrong, we might not even recognize it as our name. The pronunciation, the stresses and unstresses of the syllables of the words we speak are deeply tied to their meaning, deeply tied to their familiarity to us. If someone called me Timothy Bartle, I might not even recognize it as my name or respond to it. The same is true of our common words. When prosody began to be talked about in Greek in the ancient world, poets began dividing stress and unstressed syllable structures into what were called feet. Feet are often two-syllable structures, or sometimes three-syllable structures, which can admit of different patterns of stressed and unstressed syllables. In English, the most common type of feet are two-syllable feet. Two-syllable feet can either be made of one stressed and one unstressed syllable, one unstressed and one stressed syllable, two stressed syllables, or two unstressed syllables. Those are the possibilities. So, Bartel would be unstressed, stressed. That type of foot is called an iambic foot, or an iamb, unstressed, stressed. The opposite of it is a trochee, stressed, unstressed. If we said Bartle, that would be a trochee. A spondee is the stress-stress structure. That's where we say two syllables that are equally stressed. I'm having a hard time, we might say. Hard time, they're both stressed. And so we'd call it a spondee. Sometimes we might speak in such a way that we have two syllables that just aren't very stressed. Back of the car. Back is stressed. Car is stressed. Of the isn't stressed. If back of the car came in the middle of a line where we had even two-syllable feet, the of the, we might say, is a pyrrhic foot or a pyrrhus. It means it's both unstressed. So, iamb, trochee, spondee, pyrrhus. These are the possible syllabic structures that you can choose to use to make up any line of poetry. Now, if you just use iambs, trochees, spondees, and pyrrhuses haphazardly, there won't be really a pattern to the speech, a pattern to the line, a pattern to the poem. And when we speak just in general, we don't usually think of creating a regular rhythm. Though some people do speak more rhythmically. This is something I've noticed, that people who are often seen as gifted or very moving speakers, they have a natural cadence to their speech where they fall into regular rhythms, but then vary the rhythms at points where it's very emotionally or intellectually effective to do so. Poetry has these patterns at its disposal. So iambic pentameter is something you probably learned about in high school, and that's the most common version of an iambic line of poetry. That is pentameter, that's 5 metrical structures in a line. 5 iambs is iambic pentameter. So when we think about prosody, we have to think about the types of feet, the types of patterns of stress and unstressed syllables, and also the number of feet in a line. And once you know the type of foot in a line and the number of feet in a line, you can name the metrical structure of a line. So if you have 5 iambic structures in a row, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, that's iambic pentameter. You could have iambic monometer. Da-da. Just one iamb. You could have iambic dimeter. Da-da-da-da. You could have iambic trimeter. Da-da-da-da-da-da. You could have iambic tetrameter. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Or you can have iambic pentameter. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. You could also do iambic hexameter, iambic septameter, iambic octameter, iambic nontameter, 9 repeating iambs. It's worth saying that in English poetry, it's usually iambic trimeter through hexameter that are kind of the range of normal metrical structures. Beyond hexameter, a line will sometimes feel like we need to break it in two. Now let's talk about 3-syllable feet. 3-syllable feet are less known in English, and yet 3-syllable feet often are creating the rhythms of some of our most well-known poems. 'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house, not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. We know that. Sometimes we might even make fun of a poem like that. It's so well known in our culture. That's not using 2-syllable feet. There's not a basic iambic or trochaic structure in that. What it's using is a 3-syllable foot. Now, as I mentioned earlier, 3-syllable feet are things that we inherited from the Greeks. And because the Greeks and the Latins had longer words on average than we do in English, partly because they have a lot more complex inflection in their nouns and verbs and adjectives, they just needed longer structures in order to accommodate those longer words. And it also opens up more syllabic and metrical possibilities within their prosody. So 3-syllable feet, unlike 2-syllable feet, have a lot more types. Now, the 3-syllable feet we're most familiar with in English are the anapest and the dactyl. The anapest is kind of like an iambic foot with just an extra unstressed syllable on the front. So instead of da-da, the iambic 2-syllable foot, we have da-da-da, the anapestic 3-syllable foot. 'Twas the night before Christmas and all through the house. That is an anapestic line of poetry. The dactyl is the opposite. It's stressed, unstressed, unstressed. I talk about Evangeline a lot, and I'm going to point you back to Evangeline as the key place in the English poetic tradition that we get the dactyl. This is the forest primeval, the murmuring pines and the hemlocks. Hemlocks right there is a trochee, but all the other feet are da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. This is dactyl. Now, anapaests and dactyls are kind of the only two types of three-syllable feet we find much in the English language tradition. But the Greeks and Latins had many more versions. In fact, if you have three syllables, you have a lot of different things you could do. So, for instance, say you want to do three unstressed syllables. Not very common in a line of English poetry, but it's possible. Three unstressed syllables is called a tribrach. What about three stressed syllables? Kind of like a super spondee. This has perhaps my favorite title of any type of foot, the molossus. Da, da, da. Uncommon, but not utterly unheard of. This is something that it's really hard to explain, but also very important to understand about the study of prosody. Often people don't like studying things like metrical structures and, is this iambic pentameter and how can I make this line more exactly trochaic? They don't like doing this because they think it stifles them. It makes everything too regular and safe. They want to be wild. They want to be free. You have to know the nature of the language in order to wield it well. This is why I'm so worried about AI. We are humans who I think are deeply and intrinsically made to communicate in many, many ways. Language is a way we communicate. We've inherited English, and it is our responsibility as we grow up and make our way in this wayward world to use that which has been given to us, that which we have inherited. And the very nature of language is something we have inherited. And so to know how it works in its rhythmic structures is to, I think, become more fully a participant in human culture, human society, and human history. Some say you need to know the rules to break them. No, I think that's too shallow. You need to know the nature of language in order to use it well. Maybe you want to intentionally write poetic lines that don't have a regular meter. Well, you'll need to know poetic meter in order to make sure you're doing that. There are very powerful poems that seem to be written in free verse, where at the very last line of a poem, the poet, knowing the nature of language, will pull everything into a perfect line of iambic pentameter and snap it perfectly shut. I think you see that in Tempest all the time. He gets wild with, spondaic substitutions and trochaic substitutions, and then he pulls things better. We are such stuff as dreams are made upon. Our little life is rounded with a sleep. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Perfect iambs. Learn prosody. You also have the amphibrach. The amphibrach is unstressed, stressed, unstressed. You have the cretic or amphimeter. These are getting really out there, which is stressed, unstressed, stressed, kind of the opposite of the amphibrach. You have a Bacchus, or Bacchius, which is unstressed, stressed, stressed. There should also be a stressed, stressed, unstressed. That's an anti-Bacchius for those of you keeping track at home. Now, the Bacchius, the antibacchius, the amphibrach, the tribrach, these are things that we don't use much in English. You could, though, try writing in amphibrachs if you wanted to. That would be a da-da-da, da-da-da, da-da-da.